Okay, so again, thank you everyone for coming along. My name's Anjana Roy. I'm from Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council. We're a discrimination and immigration and hate crime advice organisation, and we do free representation to people who experience discrimination on any protected characteristic, any kind of disability, race, gender, sexuality, religion and belief, non-belief, pregnancy, maternity. We're co-hosting this event with the Autism Champions Network, and I'm going to ask Louise to just say a few words about the Autism Champions Network.
Well, thank you. Yes, I'm Louise Kirby and I facilitate the Northamptonshire Autism Champion Network. And originally I asked Tre to speak at one of our network meetings. He came up with the much better idea of opening it wider, and the Autism Champion Network is really pleased to be supporting this event. The Autism Champion Network started because when we were co-producing autistic people saying that there was a lack of general awareness from professionals as to why autistic people behave as they do. It's a non-hierarchical cross-organisational network that includes the key services that support autistic people, as well as equals, autistic people who are experts by virtue of lived experience. We work together with a vision of improving experiences for autistic people and their families. We're very keen to welcome onto the network autistic representation from all ethnic minority backgrounds and different intersectionalities. We want to enable the whole diversity of autistic voices to be heard in our aim to improve experiences for autistic people and their families, whatever their background, however they communicate. I hope through this event we might reach out to a wider audience and would love to hear from you if you may be interested in joining us or finding out more. We'll put our email address in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Louise. We're very grateful. We're still getting a few people join. Just to say, if you can keep your mics on mute while Tre is presenting. Tre is going to be presenting. Tre Ventour is, we're privileged enough to say, is one of the Northamptonshire Rights and Equality Council directors, but he is so much more as well in terms of the other things that he does on in terms of creative writing, raising the profile of issues relating to race, disability, sexuality, and issues relating to, in particular, race relations and youth. So without much ado, I will just hand over to Tre. Tre, if you can clarify that you will be presenting, people can put questions in the chat. Although you're unlikely to see that until afterwards, and we'll try and feed that over to you. There will be a time for questions in the session, and if there is a break of any kind, there will be time for questions. And that is, have I missed anything, Tre?
No, I think that's everything. I'm gonna go, it should be about an hour altogether, but I'm going to stop periodically if anyone's got questions as we go along, and there'll be a break after half as well, I reckon. But yeah, I'm going to share my screen now and start. And I'm going to present with my camera off as well.
Tre, you're on mute.
Yeah, is that okay, Anjona?
No, that looks good.
Yeah, okay. So my name is Tre Ventour, and I'm a Northamptonshire-based race and Black history educator. I'm also an associate lecturer at the local university in criminology. So I just want to reiterate, thank you to Androna and Louise and NREC and the Autism Champion Network for agreeing to co-host and facilitate this event. So this session is an expansion on an essay I did on my master's course, and the essay looked at autism while Black, grounded in intersectionality, which is one of the core elements of critical race theory. Due to the lack of research in this area, a lot of the things I'll be talking about will be links that I've made. So taking things that we do know about race already, about racism and how it functions, and taking things that we know about how autism and ableism functions with disability, and sort of combining them together. Parts are historical, some parts are sociological, sort of based. They'd give more questions than actual answers, I think. I'm not a neuroscientist, so this will not be from a scientific perspective, but more from a social sciences perspective. But things that make the lives of Black autistic people that much harder. This is something I've wanted to speak on for a while. So though I received a dyspraxia diagnosis when I was 8 or 9 years old, it was not until I went to university in 2016. At 20 years old, I was made to think about autism when numbers of autistic students actually peer diagnosed me within my first year. So self-diagnosis is increasingly common within marginalized groups, including women, racialized minorities, and trans and non-binary people. Most recently, I've been engaging with the work of the stand-up comedian, Hannah Gadsby, who self-diagnosed her autism before she later received a formal diagnosis. The memoir Drama Queen by the British comedian Sarah Gibbs also details how self-diagnosis can be a starting point to a formal medical one. However, increasingly, self-diagnosis does not have to be the start of a road to medical diagnosis, but the start of a longer journey toward acceptance. When you consider that the barriers that exist in healthcare, i.e. racism, misogyny, ableism, transphobia, etc., diagnosis is a privilege that not everybody has, especially when you find out that the original science for autism is a lot of it is based on experiences of white boys. However, autistic people don't just start being autistic when they get that diagnosis. The fact that I have to go to TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter for info about Black experiences of autism, and really Black disability more generally, I think is as interesting as it is frightening. So where do I start a talk of this nature? I found myself thinking hard about all the conversations I've had with autistic people, and also people with co-occurring neurological differences, ADHD and dyspraxia, and I decided to start with, there have been many incidents involving autistic civilians and the police. And when I was stopped and searched as a 14-year-old in the UK, I recall my emotions were really high, and that encounter really left me with a distrust in the police in general. Many autistic people find the experiences of police distressing. In a 2016 journal article, Laura Crane and colleagues discussed how in an online survey of 394 police officers from England and Wales, only 42% were satisfied with how they interacted with autistic people, whilst 37% of police officers had received autism training needed for policing, and need for training was further identified. This article discusses police responses in relation to autistic individuals and also the parents of autistic people, who also echoed the need for training. Autistic encounters with the criminal justice system have been as victims and as suspects, and there are several publicised examples that show poor police conduct in this situation. For example, the Commissioner of the Police for the Metropolis versus ZH. This was a botched appeal by the London Metropolitan Police Service against the decision made when damages were awarded to a 1ZH as the London Met broke common law and the 1995 UK Disability Discrimination Act. For context, ZH was a mute, autistic, epileptic 16-year-old who also had learning disabilities. In September 2008, he was taken by a specialist school he went to a swimming pool for a familiarization visit. When things went awry during the visit, the manager of the establishment called the police, which gave rise to an escalating series of events leading to ZH jumping in the pool, being forcibly removed from the pool, being handcuffed and placed in a cage at the back of a police van for 40 minutes. ZH sorry about that. When things went awry during the visit, the manager of the establishment called the police, which gave rise to escalating series of events leading to CH jumping in the pool, and then being removed from the pool and being handcuffed and placed in a cage and an exacerbation of his epileptic seizures. The ruling judge on this case, Sir Robert Nelson, found the Met had committed the wrongful act of trespass and false imprisonment, with further breaching his rights under Article 3, which is prohibition of torture and inhuman or degrading treatment. Article 5, the right to liberty and security, and Article 8, right to the respect of private and family life of the European Convention on Human Rights. And they also found that they'd also breached the 1995 Disability and Discrimination Act as well. The Met appealed and the court dismissed the appeal. The officers were judged to have acted hastily and have been ill-informed after restraining ZH. A subsequent report by the Independent Commission on Mental Health and Policing highlights the lack of awareness to mental health issues and related knowledge amid police staff and officers, stressing there needs to be training for police about the communicating with people with mental health issues, people with learning disabilities, and also autistic people too. Without the context of autism and epilepsy, in my opinion, this could easily have been as interpreted as another Black person's encounter with the police, autistic or not. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Edson DaCosta, Rashan Charles, Sarah Reed, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, George Nchenko, Mark Duggan, Trayvon Martin, Joy Gardner, and I could list numbers of Black people being killed by police in the States and in the UK as well. I could list forever. So there are a few examples of violence that happen against disabled people that have not also happened to Black people, either now or historically. One of the other examples of crossover between autism and Blackness, I think, is this idea of curing autism, where so many, I've found, neurotypicals do project this idea of autism as a disease. Concurrently, under white supremacy, Blackness is also presented through projections of white being superior, i.e. via beauty magazines, so Eurocentric beauty standards, educational curricula with the whitewashing of the curriculum, our media, and our culture, and generally our culture in general, present the idea there's something inherently wrong with Black Africanness. Dabiri and Lau call this Afro-pessimism. So this idea of curing us because neurotypicals believe we have some sort of deficiency is an exceedingly common story I've been told by autistic friends and colleagues, and even seen pervaded through discourse on social media as well, in the sense that autism and generally neurodivergent neurological differences more generally, and many physical disabilities are something to be overcome, which really absolves institutions of removing ableist barriers in place. In terms of neurological differences, this idea of curing something that you're born with is something I know twice over, both as a Black person and then also as a neurodivergent person. As a Black child, the world around me conditioned me to think that being white was the best and that Blackness or brownness was inherently wrong. I could somehow cure my skin color and way of seeing and navigating the world and aspire to be essentially being white and European and culturally everything that represents. That blackness was diseased, and whiteness in all its definitions was seen as healthy and something to be aspired to. growing up, I loved the stories of the X-Men, and now an adult, I'm now understanding how it is possible to put that into a wider context of violence against Black and disabled people. Disabled people not at one time or another have not also occurred against Black people. There are lots of parallels between the X-Men stories and neurodivergence at large. In some cases, people also draw parallels between them and the civil rights movement in America, as this is also the time in which the X-Men comics were originally written in. The X-Men franchise is a good entry point into thinking about how discrimination through science impacts Black people and disabled people, and thus autistic while Black. Through these stories of the X-Men, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created relatable stories to me about demonization and bullying, which was further upheld in text by that society's institutions. The X-Men stories began in 1963. A group of teenage mutants, as they were called, helmed by their teacher and mentor, Charles Xavier, at a school for gifted youngsters. In those stories, the mutants were hated by the so-called normal humans they defended, people that did not have abilities. In those stories, there were also anti-mutant hate groups such as Strikers Purifiers. The character Bolivar Trask, played by Peter Dinklage in the 2014 film Days of Futures Past, is reminiscent of the scientists leading the Spectrum 10K project, in my view. Autism Speaks has also long been thought of as a hate group by autistic people, especially in advocacy circles as well. And it does raise reflections with those hate groups in the X-Men mythos, including the Sentinel and mutant-destroying robots introduced in the 1960s, just as Black Americans were being abused by police officers and segregation laws under Jim Crow. There are numbers of allegories that run through the X-Men that relate to Black people. But further from me, I see lots of parallels between the X-Men and neurodivergence. Many autistic people today continue to be persecuted in a world that wasn't designed for us in the first place. Societies, institutions such as the police, prisons, schools, and workplaces continue to be a site of trauma. There are also allegories between discrimination against LGBT+ communities and the experiences of the mutants in pursuit for equality and acceptance. In the 2003 film X-Men 2, Bobby Drake, aka the Iceman, is asked by his parents if he's ever tried not being a mutant. This sort of phrasing or terminology, though not in those direct terms, is very familiar to many LGBT+ people. Bobby Drake came out as gay in 2015 in the all-new X-Men issue 40. Being autistic or neurodivergent is a constant state of coming out, and that idea of policing difference is a constant through the X-Men stories, where many characters were born with their abilities and were then taught by the elders how to manage them. So what about those who are Black, disabled, and part of a wider gender and sexuality spectrum that exists outside of nuclear, cis, heterosexual distinct experiences of Black disabled? Psychologist Gwen Kinwani termed as negative ableism. She goes on to name four axis where anti-Blackness meets ableism. So she says infantilization, degeneracy, dangerousness, and superhumanization. Considering the way white autistic people are presented on television, they are infantilized. I'm thinking about programs like The A Word, which was on the BBC, and then also Young Sheldon, which was done by CBS. I begrudgingly reference the 2021 film Music, as well as the Dustin Hoffman film Rain Man, which came out in 1988. More recently, you had the Netflix series Atypical, following a character called Sam Gardner from his time in secondary school all the way up to university. These actors are predominantly playing autistic white boys and men. When you implement race into this, tracking the story to the plantation societies of the 17th and 18th century, enslaved Black people were forever treated like children, needing the guiding hand of the white master, while also treated as superhuman. Infantilization is pervasive through ableist thinking, the projection that someone is unable to do for themselves or think for themselves. This can include talking to disabled people in baby talk, And it can also be addressing the parent or colleague or the friend of the autistic person in question, while the autistic person is there, sort of talking over them in that sense. There is also the fact that not allowing us the right to express and experience adult lives as we are expected to be naive or pure. The fact that autistic people like to go out, drink alcohol, go to parties, want to work, and really many of the things that non-autistic and non-disabled people do, I find surprises quite a number of people that I've spoken to too. In the context of children, our society presents the image that parents know best and that children's rights do not matter. As Bell Hooks wrote, when we love children, we acknowledge by our very action that they are not property, that they have rights, that we respect and uphold their rights. Without justice, there can be no love. Bell Hooks was the late Bell Hooks, I should add, was a long defender of children's rights and dignity. So we must extend this philosophy to Black children, autistic Black children, disabled children. There are no exceptions here. Black children today and yesterday, autistic or not, continue to be infantilized. There is no consent, as we saw with the recent Child Q case. Dangerousness and disability have a long-reaching relationship. Autistic people and violence come at an intersection. Stereotypes, that intersection or Black takes another turn. Kinani further states that alleged dangerousness is wrapped up around white projections of aggression, notions of bestiality and out of controlness. It is this construction that led to control and restraint measures and freedom deprivation, disproportionately used when mental health services deal with Black people. This construction was central to the colonial endeavour, of course, and the need to tame, control and domesticate the dangerous and wild other. As a Black person in Britain today, I am 4 times more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. That's a very clinical statistic, and that's how it is today. So today, as a Black if I was upset on a mental health ward, I could be seen as out of control, revisiting that plantation society. And if I had an autistic meltdown, are autistic people dangerous, or are they simply overwhelmed? Doing this while Black revisits the connotations of Black people and dangerousness, violence, aggression, where in some cases upset can be interpreted as anger. Well, as Black people, we do feel the emotions that all people feel. This isn't always interpreted in a racist society. We are expected to be superhuman. The superhumanization of Black men is most obvious in policing and mental health services, when disproportionate numbers of people can be deployed to restrain one man because we supposedly have superhuman strength and that we do not feel pain. Further, to being restrained for long periods of time, as was in the case of Black men like Eric Garner, who was killed much in the same way as George Floyd. Also in the UK, David Bennett, who died for those exact same reasons while in the mental health at the start of this century, which led to an inquiry. In his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, African-American sociologist and historian W.E.B. Du Bois posed a question that is still as relevant today as it was when he wrote it in 1993. So how does it feel to be a problem? I know an excellent coloured man, or I thought at Mechanicsville, or do not these sudden outrages make your blood boil? At these I smile, or I'm interested. To the real question, how does it feel to be a problem? Yet being a problem is a strange experience, peculiar, even for one who has never been anything else. Du Bois's question at the start of the last century, the 20th century, brings brutal conversations about the dehumanization of Black people, including bodies and minds in the global North. I find this relevant in the realms of police violence, since the resurgence of anti-racism, interest in the experiences of Black victims of the police have also been revisited since 2020. And for Black people in Britain, policing has been a long site of oppression and resistance. These experiences show a normative presenting story of Blackness, so a story that is cisgender, presumably straight, neurotypical, able-bodied, often male as well. So even within an oppressed group, there was a normative line of inquiry that often gets encapsulated by mainstream media narratives. In September 2020, autistic 13-year-old Lyndon Cameron was seriously injured after being shot by the police at Salt Lake City in the US. But Cameron was white. Yet through the lens of Kimberlé Crenshaw's 1989 treatise of intersectionality, it does not really take too long to realize how being Black and autistic may amplify stereotypes when Black people and autistic people, respectively, are at greater risk of being stopped by the police. A study done by the Drake Autism Institute says that 20% of autistic teens in the US will be stopped and questioned by the police before they reach adulthood. And the assault on Troy Canals outside of his home in 2015, 17 years old at the time, is an example of what can happen when being autistic while Black, compounded by the discrimination that comes with race and disability. So with Black and autistic people, respectively, being at greater risk of being stopped when we are both, this can compound violence. Considering Black children's interactions with the police, we must also think about adultification, where Black children can be viewed as older than they are. The Child Q case that has come to public attention in the UK is an example of this. So for context, for those looking in tuning in from outside of the UK, school teachers called the police on a Black schoolgirl who reportedly smelled of cannabis. She was 15 years old and was thus strip searched by London Met police officers while on her period, and had to remove her sanitary towel. And they did not inform her parents as well. That girl is now traumatized. Whilst we do not know whether this girl is autistic, it would be reasonable to think about how Black girls with autism are also at greater risk of police contact when neurotypical Black girls are also at risk of police contact as well. So through that lens of intersectionality, we can widen our gaze to see how our eyes see is sometimes not what is happening. The recent Autism Brown case showed how ableism and white supremacy can come joined together. A victim of the ongoing hostile environment, he first came to Britain at 4 years old from Jamaica. Brown comes at an intersection. He's autistic, he's a Black male, and he's also immigrant as well. So Brown experienced a life of injustice, unable to access his basic needs, all the way to last summer, where he was nearly deported back to Jamaica, which he has not seen since he was 4 years old. In the education system, Autism was consistently labelled as rude, aggressive, and disruptive until he was 16. After he was excluded from the school system, he received a formal diagnosis of autism and then was transitioned to the foster system, where he was moved 28 times in the space of a year. He was cut off from his mother and put into a foster system that was designed to fail him, as it does so many Black children and also neurodiverse men in similar situations. One night, two of his friends stole a mobile phone. Autism did not have any involvement in that, reportedly, but he was sentenced by the now unlawful joint enterprise guilty by association years. Under the hostile environment, he was set to be deported for a crime he did not commit, a country he had not seen since he was 4 years old. In prison, he had been over-medicated for control. Now isolated, prison guards stole his drawings and artwork, goading him into violence, his body now scarred by self-harm and regulating his pain. He was denied help and support in his education experience, and then that series of events further led him to be failed by the foster system, the criminal justice system, and then the Home Office, showing how Britain's institutions act, and that this is not an anomaly. The Windrush scandal is ongoing, and people are still being deported under these similar pretenses. The specific social harms Black disabled people face is missing from conversations about anti-racism and ableism, including the police. Of the numerous Black people killed by the police in the US, and many had disabilities and or mental health issues, including Eric Garner, who was asthmatic, he was diabetic, and also had a heart condition. He was killed in much in the same way as George Floyd. Tanisha Anderson was bipolar. Sandra Bland was epileptic and also had depression. Deborah Danner was schizophrenic. Elijah McClain was autistic. And there are many inspired into us. So many victims have been disabled and Black. Does anyone have questions so far? And Jonas, is anyone, because I can see there's people have been writing in the chat.
People have been writing in the chat. We had a specific request to put on the auto subtitles, which I have to confess I don't know how to do. But apart from that, there's been no other.
Okay.
Let me just check. Oh, question from Renee. As a way of justifying slavery, white enslavers perpetuated the notion of Sambo stereotype, which asserts Black men as specifically lazy and docile, categorizing what many slave apologists deemed as a disabled race in reference to Blackness. Disability and neurodiversity were not considered as individual, but as collective in the Black community in that white imagination. Would you say that this historical thinking contributes in the dismissal of autistic neurodivergent Black people and as a failure to consider their specific needs? On the other hand, do you think that this may also contribute to the misdiagnosis of Black people in regards to disability, neurodiversity, and mental illness?
Okay. Can you say the first question again, please?
It's all right. Would you say that this historical thinking contributes to the dismissal of autistic neurodivergent Black people and a failure to consider their specific needs? Or on the other hand, do you think that this may also contribute to the misdiagnosis of Black people in regards to disability, neurodiversity, and or mental illness?
Okay, I'm just processing. I'm sorry. So I think with the first part of the question, I would say the historical side does contribute, because like every other form of violence that's pervasive across at least the global northern context, we've let it fester from generation to generation, and we've not dealt with it properly. So I think the historical aspects are still very much alive, and you can see it as well with in terms of the stereotypes around Black people not feeling pain, and then we don't get adequate pain medication in hospital and stuff like that. So I think the historical aspects are still relevant today. And Andrea, can you say the second part of that question again, please? Sorry.
Just taking myself off mute, sorry. On the other hand, do you think this may also contribute to the misdiagnosis of Black people in regards to disability, neurodiversity, and or mental illness?
Possibly, I think, but I also think it's quite a complex topic, and quite a number of autistic people also have co-occurring neurological differences. So I know quite a number of autistic people who also have ADHD, for example. So I think it would be unfair to say outright that it's this or that, and I think it'll be just more. I think it'll be more useful to take it as an individual basis. So take each person as they stand, essentially. If that answers the question.
So I've got another little message from Renee, who put that question. I'm going to ask Renee, would you like to unmute and respond directly to Tre? We've also got another question, but that is for later, is my understanding. So Renee, is there anything else that you want to say?
Okay.
No, there's nothing else. I think Trey answered it perfectly. Sorry, that comment came in a little bit later, but no, I think you answered that perfectly. Thank you for that.
Oh, thanks for your questions. Was there any other questions, Androna, in the chat?
There was one, but there's two. One that is saying is a question for later, and the other one from Patsy Wright. Is there less stroke later diagnosis of autism in Black people?
I think that would be a question for a neuroscientist. I think you need to talk to someone who studied the science. I think with that. So yeah, I think that would be one for them. So I don't think I can answer that question.
Okay, so do you want to carry on then, Trey?
Yeah. Okay, yeah, so this definition of ableism I came across actually by accident. It's by a disability advocate called Talia Lewis, and she says a system, so she describes ableism as a system places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and/or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. And she ends it by saying you do not have to be disabled to experience ableism, which I found quite interesting as well. So autistic and/or disabled while Black has a very human context, especially when you do not, in the words of Talia Lewis, have to be disabled to experience it. Simply, I think being Black can be disabling via our very reality of living in a white supremacist society and or world. A system that allots value on people's bodies and minds, constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, and others. The education system for many autistic people can be a site of trauma. For autistic students then who do STEM or have fidget objects, script, wear noise cancelling headphones, and can't sit still for long periods of time, avoid bright lights or even elope from situations, they are reducing themselves to fit into a metric that was not designed for us in the first place. Hyper-focusing on special interests while Black goes back to those previous ideas about superhumanity. It still plays into this idea of those with neurological differences being somehow mentally deficient, which also includes being unable to behave in the same ways as neurotypicals. We get the tasks done. Someone not on mute. Androna.
I think I've sorted it.
Okay, fine. Yeah, we get the task done, but then we do things too quickly and too well and too quickly, and I think some people start to get a bit suspicious and think that hyper-productivity is somewhat subhumanly superhuman in that way. And doing that while Black reminds me our humanity always has qualifiers attached. We are disabled by our successes and then also disabled by our failures. As an undergraduate student, I remember being stigmatized for completing large assignments in short amounts of time. Hyperfocus or autistic flow enables me to get large amounts of work done in small amounts of time. And that is very useful on a deadline. For example, I wrote my undergraduate dissertation in 3 days on holiday. And I don't say that to boast, but as an example of sort of the extremities to which hyperfocus can operate in an individual. But on the other hand, that's my personal experience. There'll be other autistic people who were not able to hyperfocus like that and could not work in such ways. And when neurotypicals couldn't work like that, they really turned me and my productivity into the problem. A Black person excelling in self-directed study while they struggled. On my master's course, however, I was in my element. I loved doing the research. I liked doing the essays as well, and my dissertation. It allowed me to deep dive into topics I was interested in. And the same sort of thing happened when I published a journal article last year, where I got to do that again. When you read that essay, neurotypicals may be boggled at the links I can make. That out of the box thinking is because of neurodivergence and not in spite of it. So that ability to hyperfixate is good, but it's also hindering when the recoil hits. So doing my undergraduate in creative writing, I think my ability to hyperfixate and even in some cases skip seminars worked to some degree in my favour. Some days my lecturers would email me as they had not seen me in a while. There was a culture in academia that being in lectures is necessary for all students to succeed. But for me, I know I did better because I wasn't at seminars all the time. So my course was a very whitewashed curriculum as well, and I was surrounded by whiteness. For me, being in those rooms multiple times a week, it hindered my ability to do work as well. Also, my seminars were designed for groups, so in terms of my specific traits, this impeded my ability to really get work done. I saw my seminars as a barrier to my study and development, not an enabler of it. Seminars can sometimes be a barrier to learners that are too self-directed, too introverted, or too independent for institutional life. Speaking to autistic people, whilst we share commonalities, we are all individuals as well. Autism and many other neurodivergence, while Black, needs its own approach for each person. This also flies in the face of many working cultures, including schools and universities. How many lecturers can know all their students by name, especially on larger courses? The way higher education is constructed doesn't allow that time and space for lecturers to know their students as human beings, and that hurts. Autistic adults can interrupt frequently. Sometimes they may have problems with teamwork, and doing that as a Black person may have onlookers thinking of you as uncooperative. Autistic people are more prone to mental health issues, not exclusively because of their autism, but because of how the world is on a different metric and how institutions see and treat you on a day-to-day. So many I know struggle with things like depression and anxiety. There's lots of crossover with that with members of the LGBT community, not because of their sexuality or because of their gender, but because of societal cultures of violence that normalize homophobia, transphobia, etc., and how that is upheld. So what about Black autistic people that are trans or non-binary or are gay or bisexual or lesbian, and the intersectional crossovers that exist between ableism, racism, and discrimination against through sexuality and gender and mental ill health? Lots of autistic people don't just have autism. Many also have occurring neurological differences like ADHD or dyspraxia, which is what I was originally diagnosed with as a child. Dyspraxics have more than our fair share of coordination and perception difficulties. Lots of these things, while Black, will impact how you are seen in environments already anti-Black by design. Behaviours that will make Black people be seen as violent or mentally or intellectually deficient by their colleagues, possibly even from other Black people who internalised those ways of seeing and thinking from the society around them. Our university experience was riddled with examples of Black people policing their own behaviours, not in terms of my own specific experience in the white academy, but how I saw Black students were being treated. In my disability, I started to police my own body language, my behaviour, afraid that if I was to express myself too openly, that would be construed as violent. I saw the numbers of Black students who were being policed in halls of residence, and the numbers of Black students expressing happiness outwardly were being thought of as violent by their lecturers and professional services. Many Black British students came from parts of North and South London And I would see their big smiles and expressions of joy and wonder and love, and them just being themselves, their best selves, but in private, but in public, completely different people. Lots of white people are not used to seeing Black joy and Black happiness on display. They're used to the trauma narratives of police violence, enslavement, colonialism, with Black people in subjugation. Within the neoliberal university, many do struggle with it. So in the lived experiences of Black people, this way of seeing reminds me that intersectional violence is ever present in our society. Patricia Hill Collins argues that intersectional paradigms are a reminder that oppression cannot always be narrowed down to a singular thing, and that multiple forms of violence can work together to produce disadvantage. Historically speaking, we can see how race and disability were stigmatized in somewhere like Nazi Germany, especially during the Holocaust, where Black people, including children, were looked upon as inferior. To grasp that idea, I think we need to sort of go back to how far back concepts of difference go. Paul C. Taylor writes, while the ancient world was for many of its inhabitants a world of multiple peoples, often enough, these peoples are sorted into two sets, us and them. However, it was in the days of Europe's empire building that race scientists, as they were called, drew on physical and cultural differences to emphasize this concept of us and them, where science journalist Angela Saini says that what Europeans saw as cultural shortcomings and populations in the early 19th century soon became conflated with how they were. In fact, we tick a box in application forms on the census and across society in relation to race and ethnicity could be due to those early colonizers who invented race. In 1795, a German physician named Johann Blumenbach surmised that humanity could be dissectioned into racial groups. Caucasians, Mongolians, Ethiopians, Americans, and Malays. He did not use the term Caucasian to only mean those read as white, but to include people who were from India and North Africa. Blumenbach concluding that I've taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus, both because of its neighborhood and especially its southern slope produced the most beautiful race of men. By seeing how race was made, Black people as targets in Nazi Germany, and even now today, I think is predictable. Nazi policies were entrenched in eugenics, with eugenics described by Angela Saini and Adam Pearson as the controversial idea that we can improve the quality of the human race by selecting who can and who cannot reproduce. Eugenics targeted specific groups of people, including the working class, the disabled, and people of colour, sterilized in the name of science, and went on to inspire the Nazis, becoming a driving force behind those death camps. These ideas do not sound too dissimilar to the beliefs perpetuated by these European-based scientists and thinkers during the 18th and 19th centuries. Do we want a break? Because I've got a break here. Or do we want to carry on? I can't see anyone, Angelina, so you're gonna have to tell me.
I'm trying to figure that one out. So I have a response from one person saying break, Kit saying 5 minutes would be good.
Yeah.
So I would suggest then we have a break, yeah? For how long did you think this should be for, Tre?
What time is it actually now? Because I can't.
It's 7:54.
I think, shall we say, yeah, 5 minutes is okay, if that's,
Yeah,
so come back at 8 o'clock.
Come back at 8, yeah?
Yeah.
All right, well, see everyone back at 8 then, thank you. You're back.
Yep. Is everyone back now?
I'm presuming everyone's back now, so
Okay.
I would just carry on.
Yeah. So yeah, carrying on, in relation to Nazi Germany, Robert Kesting argues that after 1937, over 300 Black children disappeared without a trace. And he further comments on the speculation that they were deported to killing centres. On the other hand, we could also look at that being Black in the eyes of race scientists was similar to being thought of as unintelligent or incapable of thought. Following Talia Lewis and how the ideas of white and Black were constructed, we can see that the intimate relationship between Blackness and ableism. These racial hierarchies continue to exist today. Nero articulates these racial hierarchies via Linnaeus's 1767 articulation of who was basically at the top of that hierarchy and who was essentially at the bottom. So white people are at the top and Black people at the bottom. The race science that preceded the Nazi regime reminds me to be Black in Nazi Germany was to be viewed as less than human. Disability also took the meaning of not only physical differences, but also psychological ones. In what we now call neurodivergence, these differences would then have been stigmatized. Comparatively, looking at this history now and seeing how racism and ableism can compound each other. Being Black disabled people in Nazi Germany would have been at risk of this triple threat of violence, since Blackness and disableism are not just intimately linked under white supremacy, but disability also included hereditary diseases and mental health issues. The stigmatization of Blackness was racist and ableist, as being Black was considered to be less than. The neurotype autism was founded in the Nazi era by a man called Hans Asperger, who has since been said to reportedly have collaborated in the executions of disabled children. Due to this, there is a common discourse around autistic advocacy circles that we should be moving away from that term, Asperger's, as a term for describing autistic people. Simply, autism is just autism, regardless. In this backdrop, if this happened now, autistic Black people would have been targeted and viewed as unworthy of procreation. While in the early 1900s, we begin to see disturbing links between British researchers at UCL in London and these race scientists in Germany, with Eugene Fisher's hair gauge being used to measure the whiteness of mixed race people, following the first genocide of the 20th century in Namibia, committed by the German Empire. Eugenics has a long history entrenched in the schema of anti-Blackness and ableism. So when you hear about Black autistic encounters with the police and other public services, it's part of a longer individual and collective historical story in a world where eugenics and race science have left their mark. Disability discrimination and racism sits entwined to the people who are celebrated as our heroes in our public domain. So for example, Churchill was voted the greatest Briton by the British public in 2002 poll, and then was put on the £5 note in 2016, but he was also one of the biggest supporters of eugenics movement too. Colonial statues were being toppled in 2020, while we still see resistance to teaching colonialism on the UK national curriculum. critical race theory is being contested inside and outside of party politics, while it also gives us an analytical tool for seeing why so many people are impacted by racism. Like colonialism, eugenics is often, or at least in my experience, seen as something from a past time. With autism advocacy circles, autistic people are still having to debunk applied behavioural analysis, so ABA. ABA is still being pushed on the parents of autistic children in the face of stigma that exists against disability and autism in social spaces. Britain has largely written off ABA, though that does not mean Britain is free from this conversation. But in America, it is still considered somewhat, in some places, good practice. At one point in Chris Packen's documentary that he titled Asperger's and Me, we follow Chris to the New England Centre for Children. It's a special education school based in Southborough, Massachusetts. In the documentary, the CEO likens ABA therapy with, and I quote, educational chemotherapy. It comes back to how eugenics is defined under the removing the traits that are maybe considered by some as imperfect. So today, I think it is a sad afterthought of trying to play God and a throwback to the last century. Through the UK's COVID-19 response. Through the UK's COVID-19 response that has disproportionately impacted the elderly and the disabled, you might want to consider how the most vulnerable have been thrown under the bus in the favour of the economy. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted everyone in different ways, but the disruption to things like routine and structure has been especially hard for many autistic people, including families with children. Support services have been withdrawn and the mental health crisis is set to get worse. Autism was founded by a Nazi collaborator. Anti-Blackness, eugenics, and ableism are intimately linked. COVID-19 was particularly detrimental to many of the communities also implicated in those historic violence. The elderly thrown under the bus through COVID-19 in the UK may also have included possibly Holocaust survivors who left one violent regime for another. Racial theories that saw so many children confined to those death camps, like Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Westerbork, now telling the stories that touch the face of tyranny, albeit now currently part of the UK's ageing population, left to die in the UK government's herd immunity tactics, disproportionately culling elderly dependents in the same vein as the last century. While more recently, Cambridge University's Spectrum 10K project sees DNA of autistic people for wellness. It was criticised by many of the people it was apparently designed to help. As the project saw widespread criticism in spite of race, it is worth thinking about how Spectrum 10K has the ability to harm people across numerous social markers, including race, gender, sexuality, class, and others. Spectrum 10K may be directed at autistic people. But when you think about this neurotype across society, this is a Black Lives Matter issue. It's also about trans lives and gay lives and the lives of working class people, women, non-binary people. It's about everything, everyone and everything. Increasing the baseline for all human beings so the most vulnerable are not having to fight things like this on a day-to-day basis. Here, it is reasonable to think about how historical harms can manifest themselves in what Kimberlé Crenshaw discusses as intersectionality, but also popular cultural narratives of autism are also only producing stories about white people and white disability. As Audre Lorde said, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives. So in screen media, autism has a white privilege problem. And the film and TV industry's decision to continue to present white males as really the only face of autism is implicitly stating that only their stories are of human value. With a white operating standard, it's not really surprising to see autistic Black people harmed by institutions. The experiences of autistic Black people are slipping through the cracks since the whiteness of films and TV programs about autism and autistic lives really reflect this introverted violence of white supremacy. As Charles Mills wrote, implying the existence of a system that not only privileges whites, but is run by whites. With original autism studies done on the white male brain, why should a society built on racism and misogyny include black and brown people, women, etc., into the representations of autism? Is this entirely in character? In response, there have been criticisms that that these studies are based on racist and misogynist science. In the last decade, some of the most popular screen media texts featuring autistic adults have centered white male narratives, including The Big Bang Theory, The Good Doctor, and Rain Man. Depictions of racialized minorities falter in media since, as Richard Dyer writes, at a level of representation, whites are not of a certain race, they are just the human race. However, Temple Grandin and Please Stand By come to mind when thinking about autistic women on screen, yet representations of autistic Black adults are minimal. I've yet to see a black autistic person in a TV program or film. So if anyone does know of any that I should watch, do let me know or put it in the chat. In screen media, then, the term human is synonymous with white, as only they can take up the space of autistic person, excluding any intersectional discourse and really neurodivergent disability as a collective. In the context of representation, the universality of whiteness could also be synonymous with white maleness. Ruth Frankenberg believed that in relation to white boys and men, inside the normative whiteness, white girls and women had to be pure and passive and support the ideals of the white man. As both Hannah Gadsby and Sarah Gibbs show, the fact autistic traits in girls differ to boys may run contrary to this universality of experience that whiteness presents, and might pose a challenge to patriarchy, since whiteness is, as Powell continues, associated with historical privilege and power, although it may work differently for white working class and middle class groups and other intersectional identities. Whiteness is not just an individual identity, it is embedded in different institutions like schools and the media as being the predominant identity. In such white spaces, whiteness and white Western practices are the norm, and those which do not comply are seen as outsiders and others. The white practices and identity of whiteness are afforded a kind of privilege that dominates all others, in which these privileges are only available to white groups who operate in these spaces, often at the expense of non-white. In summary, by Powell's conceptualization of whiteness applies just as well to the film and TV industry as it does to healthcare, education, sports, the police, prisons, and so on. As even in disability, autism is still something owned by white people and white institutions. Moreover, for autistic Black girls and women, ableist encounters work simultaneously with Moya Bailey's misogynoir, where race and gender can both play roles in bias. The idea that popular mainstream depictions of autistic girls and women have been white is really reaffirming the whiteness and the white gaze as the operating standard. Further to the fact that society continues to treat Black girls and women as invincible, while Black girls experience adultification, compounded by the colonial racial hierarchies I mentioned earlier. These ideas of childhood were not made for Black children, so even as young people, we are forced to become adults before we are even ready. Childhood is a privilege, and that infantilization of autism on screen, white children receive a privilege of some representation while we receive none. And that's not to say autistic white children have it easy, because many of them don't, but that is not because of their race. Mainstream media continuing with this white standard does not cater for the diversity of lived experiences. Through intersectionality, we may begin to see how anti-Blackness and ableism compound each other, and how the lack of representation of this on screen does not impact one in the same way. Their experiences, even on types, there's no more powerful position than that of being just human. The claim to power is the claim to speak for the commonality of humanity. Raced people can't do that. They can only speak for their race, but non-raced people can, for they do not represent the interests of a race. With whiteness marked as the default, It provoked me to seek out more diverse examples of neurodivergent disabilities more in general beyond television. Here are some of the social media accounts I've come across simply to gain some alternative understanding. Stuart Hall on the left believed that mainstream media representations had an agenda and consumers should find alternative sources for truth and information. Social media is part of that mainstream, but I still find it more accessible than the films and TV shows that get made. In that context of autism or Black, an ideology could be that presiding media narratives that center the white male gaze as universal. Hall didn't believe in the faceless masses, and he saw specks of resistance that undermined dominant media. So with modern representations of autism, I can see diversities of social media personalities countering narratives peddled out by the establishment. So to understand those criticisms of the whitewashing of disability, we must also look beyond white privilege. Sara Ahmed, declaring whiteness or even admitting to one's own racism and the declaration is assumed to be evidence of anti-racist commitment, does not do what it says. Neither the recognition nor the declaration change anything within themselves. So white people centering themselves and what they can do to help has the ability to hurt anti-racist struggle, even in good intent, since it ultimately centers whiteness. And thus she argues that whiteness studies should involve at least a double turn. To turn towards whiteness is to turn towards and away from the bodies who have been given agency and mobility by such privilege. In other words, the task for white subjects, so white people, would be to stay implicated in what they critique, but in turning towards their role and responsibility in these histories of racism as histories of the present, to turn away from themselves and towards the other. So, must not center whiteness, but consider the impact the normalization of it has had on those racialized outside of it. Charles Mills believes society would benefit more from reframing conversations about white privilege into one about white supremacy. Mills identifies dimensions through which white supremacy functions. So I started this talk looking at autism, racism, and the police and the criminal justice system. His juridical sphere is in relation to politics, the making of laws and their usage in the legal system. So Black autistic police brutality victims, Troy Canals and Elijah McClain, for example, this places them into a wider context of over-policing Black communities, further to the disproportionate imprisonment of Black people in the US. The fact that these two are also autistic is amplified because of their Blackness and autism and the stereotypes that come with that. The Ozim Brown case also acts as a case study for a UK context. Moving to the cultural sphere. This is most relevant to the mentioned screen media text, so films and TV shows and the like, and it panders to the continuing centering of white people as the default in the human experience of entertainment, including the way history is taught. The latest resurgence of Black Lives Matter saw a reinterest in putting Black history on the curriculum. However, what these conversations did not cover, in what I saw, is that also means conducting Black history through an intersectional gaze, including historical takes on Black disability. For example, the story of Mary Prince, who contracted rheumatoid arthritis and chronic back pain through her experiences of plantation slavery. I think looking at that story through the lens of disability, through colonialism and disability might have an interesting take if you took that into schools, for example, and got students to interrogate it through that way. I think the Black historical narrative still often follow a very cisgender, heterosexual, often able-bodied norm. I think we could go wider there, including in how we do Black History Month and that sort of thing. So next is the cognitive evaluative sphere that revolves around colonial knowledge production that center white ways of seeing, acting and being. The reasons why global Western screen media and producing houses so focused on autistic, cisgender, white, heterosexual boys may not be exclusively due to the fact that autism studies were originally done on mainly white people, white boys, but also because historically speaking, white Western ways of thinking and seeing were constructed as the norm. Sophia Ackle writes that the way in which we come to know and view the world is learned throughout our lifetimes. The British education system itself is firmly rooted in colonial epistemology, meaning knowledge production. What this can look like in schooling is a whitewashed retelling of the history of empire, admitting its evils, the voices of the oppressed, and the lasting legacy of imperialism today. Within education, there exists a complex web of coded and overt systems in which some forms of knowledge are legitimized, those which fit a narrow conservative view of British values and government of the day's agenda. What Sophia Ackle writes is applicable to really the whitewashing of disability too. It forces me to consider how autistic Black people are pushed not only to act neurotypical or mask, to protect ourselves from neurotypical violence in society, but also, to not put too fine a point on it, code switch to act white as a way to cope with the whiteness of our institutions as well. We are the diversity and we do diversity work. Sara Ahmed also talks about this in her chapter, Rocking the Boat, Women of Colour as Diversity Workers in Dismantling Race in Higher Education. Diversity is about bodies, not particularly equity, and ultimately upholds capitalist takes of what success looks like. Bodies, productivity. We are included, and then we are pushed to mask, and in many cases, act like our managers in order to survive. The next dimension is the somatic sphere. This is how society sees bodies, but I would take that further. So following the ideas of Bell Hooks, Kimberlé Crenshaw, Patricia Collins, and others, somatically Black autistic bodies may be seen differently to Black neurotypical ones, with Black autistic girls also being at the brunt of adultification and misogynoir, and Black autistic boys being subject to just the former, i.e. these stereotypes will be amplified in police encounters, engaging with education, mental health services, healthcare, and others. Violence being donned to both Black and autistic people. Charles Mills also names a philosophical metaphysical sphere, which refers to the idea that our very conceptualization of humanity is rooted in whiteness. For a Black British person to be asked the question, where are you from, as I have on more than one occasion, is often from white people who have seen I look different to them. It's embedded in white supremacy. That's not to say that these people are white supremacists or being intentionally racist, but the underpinning ideas of that question is that British people of colour are other. Like our Britishness has qualifiers attached. As Athol Hirsch writes, this question is asked by the polite and open-minded, reserved for people who look different, asked for an explanation every single day, often multiple times, a symptom of the fact we don't really know what it is to be British. Is someone like me, us included? In conclusion, then, this idea of autism while Black is a way of seeing how discrimination and violence can compound themselves in a world that privileges other ways of being and acting that have been constructed as the norm. It is also built on prior histories where ableism and anti-Blackness can often be similar in the lives of many Black people. That discrimination based on disability is ableist, but anti-Blackness is also racist and ableist when you look at how race was invented. Intersectionality is not perfect, it is an analytical tool, and one of the core tenets of critical race theory. The lives and histories of Black people and disabled people have more in common than they do not. Talia Lewis's definition reminds me how ableism and white supremacy are part of what Patricia Collins called a matrix of domination, and what Ghislaine Kinwani called Negro ableism. To see that how violence functions, we do not necessarily always have to go to new work, though new work is always useful. Scholars have been talking about this in different ways for centuries. The lineage of writing about inequality in Britain, of course, like everything else, can be traced to the scholarship of white men. I'll end with Friedrich Engels, who many of you may know from his work with Karl Marx. social murder is where you do not need to see the murderer to talk about institutional violence. When one person kills someone else, a death occurs. We call that manslaughter. And when the doer knew in advance that it's murder, when society backs people into a corner where they are put into social harm's way and are dying early because of it, so they're meeting a natural and untimely end, one which is by any means as lethal as any sword or bullet, when it prevents people from accessing vital services under conditions they cannot live, forces them through the cloud of the law. In such conditions, so death occurs as a consequence, where the state knows that thousands will be harmed, and yet these conditions continue as violence as sure as the striking down of an individual in the street. The Indra scandal, which saw the deaths of Caribbean elders before their time, at least 9 people have died before receiving compensation. Think about the numbers of people who have been killed through austerity measures. Think about the government's response to COVID-19. It is an invisible violence against which few can defend themselves because the death or harm of the person appears to be natural, since the act is more of not doing than doing, but murder it is. And this continues through the lives of many disabled people as well, and autistic people, particularly when you look at how institutions treat us and then all the mental health issues that come out of that, and the numbers of autistic people that also commit suicide. I think suicide is the biggest killer of autistic people, and largely you could put 2 and 2 together to see how institutions treat autistic people, and then see how mental health issues can rise out of that as well. So intersectionality began as an analytical tool to look at the interrelationship between race, American legal studies, and Black feminism. So it is intersectional itself. However, there is a history of Black writing about the intersections before Crenshaw made the language for it. So Black writers such as Nikki Giovanni, the poet, but also Angela Davis, Alice Walker, Bell Hooks, Patricia Hill Collins, and the Black women of the 19th century too. So like Mary Prince, who wrote her own slave narrative, which talks about race and gender and being disabled too. So yeah, autism while Black, disability while Black, it's as historical as it is sociological. And I'm sure psychology would have another avenue, have another access to look at this through as well. Lots of the writing on autism is scientific by mainly neurotypicals and not from the perspective of autistic people. So I would push you all to look at what autistic people in your families and in your communities are saying about their experience. Look at what they're saying on social media as well, and sort of compare it to what you see on television and see if it lines up. So yeah, I think that's me done. So if anyone's got any questions, I'm happy, or wants to make any statements, I'm happy to take questions or anything now. But yeah, thanks for listening and thanks for coming as well.
Well, thank you, Trey. I think we've all had we've all benefited from that. We've got a few questions there's some really nice comments in the chat which you might be able to see now. Great session, very insightful, Trey. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much. Thank you, Trey. We've, like I say, we've got a few questions that have been put in. Nicola, I know you've got your hand up, but should we do these in order that they came in, Trey? What do you think?
Yeah, I think the first one I can see is from Zal.
We had a couple of questions from Zal. Are there any studies on the rate of diagnosis which you've dealt with? And also, would be interested to know the impact of Western misrepresentation in the global South. I've noticed a lot of internalized ableism against autism in the global South, a lot of which comes from projecting the colonial perspective of it and misrepresentation of autism as being something that happens to white people. What can be done, could be done to change these perspectives?
I'm not. I don't know about specific stuff on that. Activists and so on who are based in the global south. And I think in terms of perspectives, I think it would be about just going into those communities and talking to people and seeing what it is and see basically what we're up against. Essentially, I think that's what I'll do first. But I also think it's about community building too. Anti-racism is much easier when you've got collective, I think. And when it comes to disability activism as well, it's good to have people around you that know, especially it can't just be younger people doing it. I think the generational knowledge is important there. So I'll just use anti-racism as an example. So I'm 26 now, but then my parents' generation, who are now in their early 50s, late 40s, who were living through racism in the 80s, bring another perspective. My grandparents' generation, who are the Windrush generation, bring another perspective from the 70s and the 60s. And I think the same thing could be done in terms of disability advocacy as well. And the elder activists and getting them involved and learning from what's happened before and not to do it wrong twice, essentially. So I think that's probably where I'd go in terms of going into those communities too. Does that answer your question, Zal?
Zal, do you want to comment?
Sorry, I was just trying to learn. Yeah, it does answer my question. That was actually really helpful. And it does make sense, yeah. Like older generations do need to contribute towards that.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah. Thank you so much.
We have a question from John Dudley. She's asking, Tre, did you discuss with your lecturers that you didn't necessarily need to attend lectures prior to the courses? If so, what was their response, please?
In one specific lecturer, I had disagreements with, and essentially I went to ask him, like, how can I improve my grade? Essentially, because at the point I was on a 2-1, I was in my 3rd year, and he basically said, you should be grateful that you're on a 2-1. So essentially, that basically put me off going to lectures to ask for help or to ask for anything at the end of my 3rd year. So no, I didn't ask them, and I've not talked to them since, because I was quite distrustful of the whole authority structure of universities in general, even though I now work in one, but still. So yeah, no, the answer is no to that question.
We've got a question from Kit. Actually, anyone who's asking a question, if you want to ask your own question, please do so. Kit, do you want to? Otherwise, I will read it out.
I can do if you like.
Go ahead.
I would have find what I wrote now.
Do you want me to put it in the chat for you?
It's okay, I've got there. So yeah, there was a couple of different ones. So firstly, I was thinking about, and this is something I've discussed with you before, that as a white autistic person, I found the police treated me better and with more understanding of my autism than mental health professionals have. But am I right in expecting this to be different for Black autistic people?
Well, I don't think you would, because I think when you look at the data and even just experiences of Black people in general with the police or mental health compared to white people, irrespective of any disability or whatever, that it is disproportionate, whether that's imprisonment rates. So I think in terms of youth offenders prisons, for example, I know in the Lamy review, incarceration rate for Black youth or Black and minority youth was something like, I think it was 40%. It was exceedingly high in 2017, and in the 5 years since he's done the Lamy review. So in 2020, he he did an update of it in the House of Commons that Boris was meant to turn up to, and he didn't, in typical Boris Johnson fashion, and that it had gone up 10% since 2017, and that was 20 people. And I don't have the knowledge on if any of those people are neurodivergent, but the likelihood is quite a number of them probably are at the same time. So yeah, I don't think, so when it comes to disability, then just looking at race, then you add disability into the mix, whether you're white or black, you're still going to be treated generally not nice, but it'll be worse if you're not white, essentially. Yeah.
Okay, and then Nicola, we've got a question from you. Do you want to ask your own question?
Oh, Trey, I've got a million questions. So fantastically insightful. Thank you so much. I have put some stuff in the chat, but I'm just wondering what white people can do to change this awful situation. We are only 11% of the global population, yet we are extremely violent and domineering in every aspect of life. And I really think that a lot of white people don't get this. They don't understand the historical racism, the shared history that we have. And as a mother of a mixed race child who's currently going through the education system, and with my organisation, Parents United Against Racism, which I set up to help parents make complaints of racial bullying, so they don't get swept under the carpet. I'm just wondering how can we make these institutions change so that our children are not leaving education feeling less than, and then going into a wider world with a system that is set up to make them fail. I find it mind-boggling.
Was that rhetorical? Do you want me to give a thought?
Oh, sorry, I was muted all that time when I was giving a.
No, we could hear you, Nicola. We did hear your question. We did hear it.
All right, okay.
Do you want me to thought, or was that just an open, like, was it an open question, or was it a question like you want me to answer?
I don't know. If you've got any nuggets of suggestions on how to. I've got a current thing going on with my son's school where he was expelled for 2 days for basically throwing a napkin on the floor and refusing to pick it up. He was accused of much more than that, which led to a 2-day exclusion, but it come a week after some year 10 lads chanted the N-word over and over in his face. And my argument to the school is, or to the chair of governors is, how can you give a lad the same exclusion as a 2-day exclusion as a racist bully? And like the head of year 10 said to me, I don't see these lads as racist, I see them as immature. And I said, well, if chanting the N-word over and over in someone's face isn't racist bullying, then what is? And, this is mild compared to the people that I'm helping from the age of 4 all the way up to university. It's shocking. So again, it's not really a question, it's just a statement.
I think there's especially in parts of the UK that are less diverse. I think a lot of white people need to look at how whiteness is different depending on geography and like nationality and class and stuff. So to say all white people are the same would be inaccurate. When we know that whiteness splits depending on your culture, your cultural background, your class, your nationality, and so on. And I think I'd tell people who are based in communities where it is predominantly white to look into that, I think. And there's a great book called What White People Can Do Next, from Allyship to Coalition by Emma Dabry. where she talks. There's a whole section about this and how to say all white people are all the same is wrong. And we've seen it with the war in Ukraine, and how refugees have been treated essentially. So if you're a white refugee, it's sort of okay, but if you're a brown or black refugee, it's not. So that's really how whiteness is different. George Orwell writes about this as well in The Road to the Wigan Pier, and he talks about working class communities in the 1920s, and how rich white people were taught to see poor white people as dirty, essentially. So they're white, but they're not white enough, essentially. And there's loads of writing about this, about how extending the gaze to whiteness within white communities would probably be a really good way, I think, for schools to look at. So schools that will say, we don't have racism because there's no people of colour here. But yeah, you probably do have racism. There probably is bias, but it's happening in different ways than it would than somewhere like Tottenham in London. So I think that's basically what I'll tell you to go and look at whiteness and all the writing about that, and then see how it applies to your area and what people are saying in your area.
Thanks for that. I will.
Yeah.
I've got a meeting with the Chair of Governors, and I will be discussing whiteness now. Thank you.
Can I just add something for Nicola? Trey, can I interrupt you? My name's Lorna Brown. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Oh, hi there. I'm a parent of she's 27 now, of an autistic daughter, and we're African Caribbean, and we were residing in a majority white middle class area for school. And when we faced some of the struggles that you're going through, Nicola, with your son, one of the easiest things to do is to just ask them or quote them on their own policies, and then equate it to what you're exactly going through, because they'll be arguing not with you but with their own policies, and you get through the line through that. Once you can prove they are going against the policies, then that's where you have a leg to stand on, and then it's overturned and you stay calm, very calm. Yes,
it's a bit difficult. It's so emotional.
It is emotional, but it gets work. It doesn't. You're not helping anybody if you let that emotion go.
Lorna, if I can also say, parents can also get support to challenge that. If you do think it is going to be difficult to keep hold of your emotions, you might want to do that in writing. And that is something that our organisation can help with in terms of writing a complaint letter, citing the legislation. I've put in the chat incidents that you have described are not only racist and unacceptable, they are also unlawful. So one of your routes might be also to be reported, depending on your view about it, depending on the view, the ages of the children, etc., to report it to the police as a racially aggravated public order act offence. Trey, I have one more question for you from a member of staff in my organisation.
I just saw another point that Nicola made in the chat about should more Black people be identifying with English and Welsh, I think it said on there. And just as a point of reference, David Lammy tried to do that last year.
Yes, all right.
Got completely annihilated on Twitter. But I sort of agree with what you're saying though. Especially when you look at the history of England, there were Black people here in Anglo-Saxon times. There were Black and brown people here 8,000 years before the Romans arrived.
Well,
so I think
the first Black Roman Empire was emperor was actually in York, and the head of the empire is central from where the emperor is.
Yeah, I mean,
Sirius, I think his name was.
The city of London was or commissioned by a man called I think it was Septimus Severus.
Yes, that's him.
And he
sounds very Hogwartsy.
Yeah, and he was born in modern day Libya, essentially.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And he died in York. But there's numbers of Black Afro-Romans, many of them are of mixed race heritage as well. So yeah, like Black English and that whole debate, I think that there's a lot going for it there, especially historically speaking, because Black people have been here in England far beyond colonialism and migration and stuff. Yeah. What was that question, Androna?
Well, we've got that question and we've got a hand raised from Kit. So the question from Jenny, who can't be here because she's working at another meeting with Northamptonshire Sport this evening. Her question, why, I think it is about terminology, why the terminology Black Autistics? She says, it feels uncomfortable to me and I understand individuals will identify themselves, but I'm not sure this shows the empathy to the person it affects. I think Black Autism Matters may have been a more appropriate title, but she would be glad to be advised, as she seems to be coming across a lot more people openly identifying about how autism has affected their lives. So I think this is about getting the language right. What's the right language?
Yeah, I think with that as well, I was thinking about that. And I think for me, it was more about, I was thinking about semantics as well, what people would understand. But I'm also thinking about language will shift, and it does every few years. So what we're saying now in terms of language probably won't be relevant in 5 years or 10 years. So when the social paradigm shifts again, I think a lot of language we use around disability and even anti-racism might become obsolete in the next few years as well. So I think that's an ongoing conversation really about language, and I want to get it right. But if I get it wrong, I'd like to know if people would tell me that I'm wrong and tell me what is good as well. So yeah. And Kit's just put something in the chat about first language.
She's also got a hand up. I don't know whether she wants to come in on that.
I had my hand up separately on something else I put later, but yeah, I just want to say that kind of in terms of, I deliberately use identity first language, autistic too, and it is quite significant, and it's generally, although it's majority preference in the autistic community, though obviously not everyone agrees because we're all different, and it is around this thing of saying it's part of my identity, it's not something I'm ashamed of or need to be separated from, because it's not a bad thing. Just like I wouldn't say I'm a person with gay, is the way I put it. That would sound really odd. I'm a gay person, I don't need that to be separated off to know that's not all I am. But for some people feel they have to put autism at a distance. So yeah, for some of us it's really important to use that language, but as with everything, it's people using the language they want to describe themselves. While I'm unmuted, shall I go on to what I was going to...
Yeah, what's your other question?
Originally. So I was thinking about, you mentioned ABBA earlier, a form of behavioural therapy, which unfortunately we do have in the UK, just by a different name or different similar sorts of, as I'm sure you're aware. And as you know, in the LGBTQ community, like, we're very aware that there is a close link between this therapy and conversion therapy used on gay and trans people, and the LGBTQ people. Are there any similar links in terms of treatment of Black people? Because I know that goes back to a particular psychologist and a particular form of treatment of others, but I didn't know if there were similar links explicitly.
Off the top of my head, I can only pinpoint in terms of experimentation on Black bodies during colonialism and stuff like that, and slavery. One of the, I think one of the most well-known examples, or not well-known, could be the J. Marion Sims experiments on enslaved Black women in the States, and J. Marion Sims was the founder of modern gynecology, and he experimented on enslaved Black women, essentially, genitalia and stuff like that, and that's one example of it. So racism through science. So yeah, and there's numerous examples. There's the Tuskegee study as well. In America as well, French colonizers in Africa as well also experimented on their colonial subjects. In terms of citations for that, I'll get back to you on that one. But, I remember I saw Athol Hirsch talking about it at one point on she was tweeting about it, because at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, the French government were making claims that they were going to test the vaccine in Africa before they were going to test it on people in Europe, essentially. And that was right at the beginning of COVID. Yeah, there's probably quite a lot of crossover there. But yeah, science, medical science, psychology, psychiatry. So Franz Fanon's book, Wretched of the Earth, goes into this. But yeah, there's probably a lot. If I go digging, I can find some stuff for you, because I have got it somewhere. But off the top of my head, those are things I can remember.
Thanks, Tre.
Yeah.
And any more questions? So I'm not seeing any more questions. There's something in the chat from Louise about the Autism Champion Network, and she's put the email in again. We have a hand raised from Regine. Not so sure if I spelt your name right. Do you want to?
Hello. Can you see and hear me okay? Okay. I just had like a quick comment and question. So I don't live in the UK, I live in a different country, but I did this forum today because I wanted to learn more about the forums. So the education system, I can see that there's some barriers there. So in terms of, so what I want to comment on and ask is like the representation. So I know when you would have to look at the policy and who's on the board. So how, like, if we wanted to make the curriculum more like inclusive for people with autism in the curriculum system, how would people with autism be able to get onto the boards or in the actual classroom to try and make change to eliminate some of the barriers and make it more inclusive?
I'm a bit conscious about the idea that more representation leads to change, because I think in concept it makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't always pan out like that. But I think in terms of autistic representation in the curriculum, yeah, it probably would start with getting more autistic people in senior leadership positions. But then I think that also means, like, if you do that, are you sending these people into a culture that's already hostile to them at the same time? Because we've seen how it happens with, let's say people of color, for example, in institutions. You could have more diverse staff. You could have a company that's 60% Black and Asian people, but that company's still racist through its policy making and its culture, essentially. And a system can still be ableist, even if it's 40% autistic. So I think doing that representation, we probably need more thinking about and discussion before we send autistic people into a hostile environment. And that's if they're white. If they're autistic as a Black person who also has co-occurring other characteristics as well, then we've got other elements of discrimination to consider too. So I think I would be cautiously optimistic before I equate more people in senior leadership positions with equity, essentially. Because in the UK context, we have a woman of Ugandan Indian heritage in the government as the Home Secretary, who was he's pioneering policies that would not have allowed her parents to enter the country back in the 1970s. We've also got another equalities minister who's Black, who doesn't believe the curriculum is colonized. There are numerous Black and brown people in Britain who are acting against the interests of Black and brown people. So I think it's not always useful to equate those things together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, because I The reason why is because I can see, I mean, it's not going to be where I live in Canada, so it's not, but I could see that there is like it's a different type of racism that experienced here in the education system. I'm not saying that it's perfect, because yes, there is like the racial barriers, but I did see like some correlation there, because it's the same thing here too as well, where, you know, they try to make it more inclusive, but then it always comes back, oh, well, you know, we need more Black people on the boards, or we need more marginal representation. And then the representation is there, but then they can't get what they want because they're fighting a system based on whiteness. So they may be the only like Black person or the non-white person in voice their opinions in a room full of white people based on a system of whiteness. So then there's the barriers, then you start having a divided system within a system.
Whiteness as well. I mean, there I was quite surface level about it. I did talk about white as in white people, but whiteness is also, it's a school of thought, and you don't have to be white to perpetuate it as well. So person of color who's grown up, say Black person's grown up in Jamaica, which is formerly a British colony, where people still aspire to Britishness, that is embodying whiteness. And I see that quite a lot in Black Caribbean communities. So that idea of whiteness is, yes, it's to do with being white, but it's also about what you can internalize it too, and anyone can reproduce it, and that's why I think that's why our institutions are the way they are, because you don't have to be white to uphold it. Yeah, thanks for your question.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Nicola has put her hand up again.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about, you know, I've put in the chat earlier that white people are 11% of the global population. That will go down to 6% with it by 2100. And I just don't get the way how we as white people are. I mean, I was shocked. I thought we were half the global population the way how we carry on. You know, I didn't know we were just a small percentage. I mean, at my other organisation, partnership, we don't use authority. I think language is very important, but my question was about, you know, we're 22 years into the new millennium, and it seems like things are getting worse, not better. And I'm just wondering, do you think that's due to the fact that there's big money to be made out of being racist, in terms of when you look at, say, the far right in America, and, you know, you can make thousands through spurting out vile language and getting a following through that. And do you think if things are getting worse because there's money to be made, just like there's money to be made by the anti-vaxxers?
I think there's money everywhere. Like, it's like racism and money. Race was invented through colonialism and through the extraction of labor and plantation slavery and things like that. And so I think the idea of money and racism is not a new thing either. So I don't think it's that. I think what's different today is social media and that sort of thing. So I think more people know about the equality initiatives, but concurrently more people also know about the sorts of Tommy Robinson figures and those sorts of far right figures as well. So yeah, I don't think it is just about money. I think it's much easier to perpetuate racist messaging through social media, and UKIP were very good at it during the time when Jeremy Corbyn was campaigning, and Labour were very bad at social media around that time as well. I bet I can see Andrea nodding. Yeah, so I think especially when you look at who they would try to recruit to their messaging as well. They go around and they promise to give you things that you can't get for yourself, and then you get brought into it. So if you're homeless, for example, and you get offered food and a house to live in, you're going to say yes, give it to me, essentially. And that's I think that's how UKIP and parties like that were quite successful in recruiting, because they go to you at your most vulnerable and they promise you all of these things, essentially. So I think money is part of it, but I think on the other side of it, you have to admit some people don't like black people and brown people, and that's sort of the bitter pill to swallow. And I think a lot of white people find that really hard to swallow, that people they've called neighbours for years do not like people of colour, whilst people like me and Androna are quite used to that, because that's how we've grown up, and we've grown up talking about it as well. So yeah.
I'm just going to ask if there are any more questions. I'm just conscious of the time. I'm conscious of the pressure on you, Tre, because you've been kind of like speaking for about 2 hours now. So that's quite a lot of pressure. If there aren't any more, if there aren't any more questions, I just wondered whether we could show our appreciation just to either virtually or with the reactions to what's going on in terms of the presentation by Tre. Thank you. Really good. Thank you. And if you've enjoyed today's event, I'm just going to share some information about some Northamptonshire REC events coming on in the next few days. So we've started coordinating a community hate incident network. So if you've got issues around hate, either in schools or out school, have been a victim, or you're just concerned about it, we've got that a session on Thursday coming up. We've also got a piece of work that we've been doing in collaboration with QSpace, QStory and Trangst in strategic messaging. We've got 2 sessions coming up in April. We've still got space for people to book on to that. And what we're going to be doing is it's an opportunity to be part of an event to change public opinion. I'm saying this partly because I think there are strong links between neurodiversity and issues relating to people who want to transition. So this is an opportunity to create narratives to change public opinion around people who identify as trans and are facing hate. So those are 2 opportunities. Again, I'd like to give one more plug for Louisa's call to join the Autism Champions Network. And again, we'll be sending you the email address to join. And also for our own organisation, if you like our work, please join us as well. But thank you very much, everyone who attended. And again, thank you so much, Tre, for giving up so much of your time and effort. We will be emailing participants after this with the link to the recording once it's up. But also it's a set of resources that Tre has put together. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you, Tre and Jonah. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Thank you all for participating, and thank you for the amazing questions as well. And on that note, goodbye and have a good evening.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. Good luck, Nicola. Thank you, Tre. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tre. Bye.